The cold Montana night was unforgiving as Nora Blackwood fled barefoot through the forest, her thin cotton nightdress offering little protection against the October chill of 1878. Blood trickled from her split lip, and purple bruises bloomed across her arms where her husband's fingers had dug into her flesh only moments before. The distant howl of a wolf echoed through the pines, but Nora pressed forward. The beast in the wilderness was far less terrifying than the one she had left behind. The daughter of a schoolteacher, 22-year-old Nora had been raised with books and dreams rather than practicality. When handsome timber baron Victor Blackwood had courted her with poetry and promises, she had believed she was stepping into a fairy tale. Instead, she had entered a prison of wealth and violence, where the polished facade of their grand house masked the ugliness within. Tonight had been different. Tonight, Victor had gone too far, his rage turning to something darker than ever before. The glint in his eyes had told her she might not survive until morning if she stayed. So she ran, her feet bloody and freezing, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She had no destination, no plan, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and the man who had sworn to love and cherish her. The lights of a small homestead flickered in the distance, a beacon in the darkness. Nora's legs trembled with exhaustion and cold as she stumbled toward it, praying for mercy from whoever dwelled within. The last of her strength abandoned her as she reached the clearing, her knees buckling as the cabin door opened. Yancey Rhodes had been up late mending a saddle by lamplight when he heard the commotion outside. At 30 years old, he had spent most of his life on horseback, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana before finally saving enough to purchase his own modest spread. He wasn't a man who startled easily, but the sight that greeted him when he opened his door with rifle in hand stopped him cold. A woman lay crumpled at the edge of his clearing, her nightdress torn and dirty, her dark hair tangled around a face marked with bruises. Without hesitation, Yancey slung his rifle over his shoulder and rushed to her side. As he knelt beside her, she flinched away, her eyes a startling shade of green wide with terror. "I won't hurt you, madam," he said softly, shrugging out of his worn leather duster. "You're safe now." Gently, he wrapped the coat around her shivering frame. The garment dwarfed her small figure, but it was warm from his body heat. When he carefully gathered her into his arms, she was too weak to protest. Her skin was like ice against his. "My name's Yancey Rhodes," he told her as he carried her toward the cabin. "And you look like you've been through hell itself." The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak. "And Nora," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Nora Blackwood." Recognition flickered in Yancey's eyes. Everyone in the county knew of Victor Blackwood, the powerful businessman who owned half the timber rights in the territory. The man was feared more than respected, despite his wealth and standing. "Well, Miss Nora," Yancey said, deliberately omitting her married title, "let's get you warm before we worry about anything else." Inside his modest cabin, Yancey placed Nora carefully on his only chair, a sturdy wooden rocker near the cast-iron stove. He stoked the fire until the room filled with blessed heat, then busied himself boiling water and gathering clean cloths. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, careful not to make any sudden gestures that might frighten her further. "I've got some coffee brewing," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "And I can fix you something to eat if you're hungry." Nora clutched his coat tighter around herself, watching him with wary eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Yancey paused, a coffee cup in his weathered hand. "My ma raised me to believe a man who turns away someone in need isn't much of a man at all." He set the cup down on the small table beside her. "Besides, looks to me like you've had enough folks failing you already." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, but she blinked them away. "He'll come looking for me," she whispered. "Victor doesn't let go of what he considers his." "Let him come," Yancey replied, his voice hardening slightly. "This is my land. Here, you're under my protection if you want it." He didn't press her for details as he tended to the cuts on her feet, his touch clinical and respectful. When he offered her a clean shirt and pair of trousers that would swim on her slight frame, he turned his back to give her privacy to change. The simple courtesy nearly undid her. "I have nowhere to go," Nora admitted as she sat wrapped in a blanket, her feet bandaged, the coffee warming her hands. "No family, no money of my own." Yancey nodded, settling on a wooden stool across from her. "Then you'll stay here until you figure things out. I've got a lean-to off the back where I sleep in summer. I can make it comfortable enough. You can have the cabin." "You don't even know me," Nora said, baffled by his generosity. "I know enough," he replied simply. "Rest now. Morning's soon enough to make plans." That night, as Nora lay in Yancey's bed, she listened to the quiet sounds of him moving about in the lean-to, making his bed for the night. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt safe enough to close her eyes without fear. Sleep claimed her quickly, deep and dreamless for the first time in years. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. Nora woke disoriented, momentarily panicked until the events of the previous night came rushing back. The smell of coffee and bacon drew her from the bed, her borrowed clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Yancey stood at the stove, his back to her. He was tall and lean, his shoulders broad beneath his faded blue shirt. His dark hair was in need of a trim, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. When he turned to greet her, she saw that his face was weathered from years under the sun, with laugh lines crinkling at the corners of his gray eyes. "Morning," he said with a nod. "Thought you might sleep the day away. You hungry?" Nora nodded, suddenly aware of how ravenous she was. She couldn't recall the last time she had eaten. Victor had sent her to bed without supper the night before as punishment for some imagined slight. As they ate at his small table, Yancey outlined his plan. "Town's about 10 miles west. I need to ride in for supplies anyway. I can ask around, see if there's work for you, if that's what you want." "I can't impose on you," Nora began, but Yancey shook his head. "You're not imposing if you're invited," he said firmly. "And I could use the help around here if you're willing. Can't pay much, but room and board until you get on your feet." The offer was tempting. The alternative, returning to Victor or trying to make her way alone, was unthinkable. Still, she hesitated. What will people say? A woman staying with a man she barely knows. "Folks around here mind their business," Yancey replied. "But if it makes you feel better, I can tell them you're my cousin, come to help after my injury." He flexed his left hand, which Nora now noticed was slightly stiff. "Broke it last spring. Still not right for fine work." The lie was a kindness she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Not looking to be repaid, Miss Nora." His smile transformed his face, softening the hard angles. "Just looking to do what's right." That afternoon, Yancey rode into town, leaving Nora with a loaded rifle, just in case, and instructions to bar the door behind him. Alone in the cabin, she took stock of her surroundings. The place was simple but clean, with a few books stacked on a shelf, mostly practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry, but also a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass and several Shakespeare plays. She ran her fingers over the spines, surprised. Victor had mocked her love of reading, calling it a useless distraction from her wifely duties. Finding these books here, in this rough cabin, seemed like a sign. Determined to earn her keep, Nora set about cleaning. She swept the plank floors, washed the breakfast dishes, and organized the meager pantry. The physical labor was soothing, giving her mind something to focus on besides her fears. By the time Yancey returned late in the afternoon, the cabin was spotless. He paused in the doorway, clearly surprised by the transformation. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, setting down his saddlebags filled with supplies. "I wanted to," Nora replied. "It helps me feel useful." Yancey nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, I'm obliged. Place hasn't looked this good since. Well, ever, I reckon. From the saddlebags, he produced several items: a comb, a bar of lavender soap, a small jar of salve for her cuts, and most surprisingly, a book. The shopkeeper's wife helped me pick these out, he explained, a slight flush coloring his tanned face. Said a lady might need such things. Nora accepted the gifts with trembling hands, overcome by this thoughtfulness. Did you hear anything in town? She asked, changing the subject before her emotions overwhelmed her. About him. Yancey's expression darkened. Blackwood's got men asking questions, offering rewards for information. He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. But I didn't hear anyone too eager to help him. Seems your husband isn't well liked, despite his money. He's careful, Nora said quietly. Shows his true nature only behind closed doors. Well, he's made enemies all the same. The miller's son said Blackwood cheated his father out of timber rights last year. And the saloon keeper mentioned how he treats the working girls who visit the big house when you're away. The information shouldn't have hurt. Nora had long suspected Victor's infidelities, but it did. Not because she loved him anymore, but because it was one more humiliation to bear. I'm sorry, Yancey said, noticing her expression. Shouldn't have repeated such talk. No, Nora said firmly. I need to know. I've lived too long with blinders on. Over the next few days, they settled into an uneasy routine. Yancey showed Nora how to tend a small vegetable garden behind the cabin and care for the chickens that provided eggs. He taught her to chop wood, laughing when her first attempts barely scratched the logs. You'll build strength, he encouraged, standing behind her to demonstrate the proper swing. It's all in the technique. His nearness made her heart beat faster, though she tried to ignore the feeling. She hadn't thought she could ever trust a man again, yet something about Yancey's quiet strength was different from Victor's aggressive dominance. When Yancey moved, it was with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his skin, not the calculated swagger Victor had used to intimidate. On the fifth day, as they worked side by side mending fence along the northern edge of Yancey's modest property, Nora finally asked the question that had been nagging her. Have you always lived alone? Yancey paused, a post-hole digger in his hands. Not always. Was engaged once, about 6 years back. Lucy was her name, daughter of a rancher over in the next county. What happened? Nora asked, then added quickly, if you don't mind telling me. Don't mind. He resumed digging, the muscles in his forearms flexing with the effort. Influenza took her winter, before we were to marry. Took her whole family, actually. Bad year. The simple tragedy of it struck Nora deeply. I'm sorry. Yancey nodded, his expression somber. After that, I headed south for a spell. Worked cattle drives, took odd jobs. Wasn't until 3 years ago I felt ready to put down roots again. And you chose to do it alone? Seemed easier that way. He glanced at her, a half-smile softening his features. Until a certain lady came stumbling out of the woods and complicated things. The teasing note in his voice made her smile despite herself. I never meant to be a burden. You're not, he said, suddenly serious. Having you here, it's good. Cabin feels more like a home with someone to share it. The admission hung between them, neither quite ready to examine what it might mean. Instead, they returned to their work, but something had shifted, a door cracked open that neither had intended to approach so soon. That evening, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, a rider appeared on the horizon. Yancey was on his feet immediately, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Get inside, he told Nora, his voice low and urgent. Bar the door. Don't come out unless I call for you. Heart pounding, Nora obeyed, watching through a crack in the curtains as the rider approached. Relief flooded her when she recognized the local sheriff, a grizzled man named Powell whom she had met once at one of Victor's rare social gatherings. The men spoke for several minutes, their conversation too low for Nora to hear. When Yancey finally came inside, his expression was grim. "Sheriff's been asked to search for you officially," he said without preamble. "Blackwood's claiming you're unwell, that you ran off during an episode of hysteria." Cold anger washed over Nora. Of course he would say that. It's easier than admitting he beats his wife. "Powell doesn't believe him," Yancey continued, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Says he's seen too many hysterical wives with bruises to trust such claims. But he's under pressure. Blackwood's got influence with the territorial governor." "Did you tell him I'm here?" Nora asked, her voice small. "No." Yancey's gaze was steady. "Told him I'd keep an eye out, that's all." "Powell's a good man. I think he understood." "What happens now?" Yancey sighed, running a hand over his face. "We need to consider your options. You could file for divorce, but Victor would never allow it," Nora interrupted. "He'd rather see me dead than free." "Then maybe it's time to think about leaving the territory altogether," Yancey suggested. "I've got a brother in California. Ranches near Sacramento. Could be a fresh start for you." The thought of leaving sent an unexpected pang through Nora's chest. "And you? Would you come too?" The question surprised them both. Yancey stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gray eyes. "My life is here," he said finally. "Everything I've worked for. But I'd make sure you got there safely." Nora nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course he wouldn't abandon his home for a woman he barely knew. The very idea was foolish. "I'll think about it," she said, turning away so he wouldn't see the tears threatening to fall. "Thank you for the option." That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to the chorus of crickets outside and the occasional hoot of an owl. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them simple. If she stayed, Victor would eventually find her. If she fled, she would be alone again in an unfamiliar place. Neither prospect brought comfort. Near dawn, she heard Yancey rise and move about in the lean-to. The soft sounds of his morning routine were becoming familiar, the splash of water as he washed his face, the scrape of his razor, the creak of boots being pulled on. There was something profoundly comforting in the predictability of it, so different from the walking on eggshells tension of her life with Victor. When she emerged from the cabin, Yancey was already saddling his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck. "Early start?" she asked, pulling her shawl, another gift from his trip to town, tighter around her shoulders. "Need to check the north pasture fence," he explained. "Storm last night might have brought down some branches." He hesitated, then added, "You'll be all right here alone?" "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I thought I might bake bread today. Found a recipe in that book on your shelf." Yancey smiled, the expression warming his eyes. "Been a long while since I had homemade bread. My ma used to make it every Sunday." "Then I'll do my best to live up to her standard," Nora promised, returning his smile. As she watched him ride away, Nora realized with a start that she felt content. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, despite the fear that still lingered, here in this moment she felt something close to happiness. The day passed quickly as Nora busied herself with domestic tasks. The bread turned out better than she expected, filling the cabin with a warm, yeasty aroma. She found herself humming as she worked, an old folk song her father had taught her that she hadn't sung in years. It was mid-afternoon when she heard hoofbeats approaching, too soon for Yancey's return. Panic surged through her as she peered out the window. 3 riders were approaching, and even at a distance, she recognized the lead figure's posture.
Victor.
Her hands trembled as she reached for the rifle Yancey had left propped by the door. She had never fired a gun in her life, but the weight of it was reassuring as she positioned herself behind the door, ready to defend herself if necessary. The men dismounted in the clearing, Victor's voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Search the outbuildings. he commanded his companions. The woman can't have gotten far on foot. Rhodes must be hiding her. Fear turned Nora's blood to ice. If they found her here, what would happen to Yancey when he returned? Victor was not a man who forgave perceived slights, and in his mind, another man sheltering his wife would be the gravest offense. One of Victor's men approached the cabin while the other headed toward the barn. Victor himself remained mounted, surveying the property with cold contempt. Nora shrank back from the window, praying they wouldn't force their way in. A sharp knock rattled the door. "Anyone home?" called a gruff voice. Nora remained silent, the rifle clutched in her sweating hands. "Place looks empty, Mr. Blackwood," the man called after trying the door and finding it barred. "Could check inside to be sure." "Do it," Victor ordered. The sound of boots on the porch was followed by the crack of wood as the man put his shoulder to the door. Nora aimed the rifle, her heart thundering in her chest. The door splintered inward, and the man froze at the sight of her, weapon raised. "Mr. Blackwood," he called. "Found her." Victor appeared in the doorway, his handsome face a mask of false concern. "Nora, my dear," he said, his voice sickeningly gentle. "You've had us all so worried. It's time to come home." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Nora replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Leave now, Victor." Victor's eyes narrowed at the rifle in her hands. "Put that down before you hurt yourself. You don't even know how to use it." "I'm willing to learn," she countered, adjusting her grip. Victor sighed dramatically. "You see how unwell she is," he said to the man beside him. "The doctor warned me about these episodes. Delusions, paranoia. It's why I've been so concerned." "I'm not delusional," Nora spat. "Tell them, Victor. Tell them how you left these bruises. Tell them how you broke my arm last winter when I spilled wine on your new carpet." "This is painful to witness," Victor said, shaking his head sadly. "Nora, darling, you fell down the stairs. Don't you remember? The doctor said your mind might create false memories to cope with the trauma." The calculated manipulation was so familiar it made her sick. How many times had he made her doubt her own reality? How many times had she apologized for injuries he had inflicted? "No more lies," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I won't let you twist the truth anymore." Victor's false sympathy vanished, his expression hardening. "Enough of this foolishness. Put down that gun and come with me now, or I'll have no choice but to have you committed. I'm sure the Territorial Asylum would be very interested in a case of female hysteria this severe." The threat sent a chill through Nora. She had heard stories of the asylum, a place where women were locked away for the crime of being inconvenient to their husbands. Once inside, few ever emerged. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "Try me," Victor replied, a cruel smile playing at his lips. What judge would side with a runaway wife over a concerned, respected businessman? Especially when that wife is clearly deranged, threatening people with firearms. The logic was unassailable. Even as she stood her ground, Nora knew she was trapped. If she fired the rifle, she would confirm his claims of her instability. If she surrendered, she would be returning to a life of abuse, or worse, confinement in an institution. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the standoff. Through the open door, Nora saw Yancey riding hard into the clearing, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "This is private property, Blackwood," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You weren't invited." Victor turned, his lip curling in disdain. "Rhodes, I might have known you'd be involved in this sordid affair. Taking advantage of a vulnerable, confused woman, how typical of your kind." "The only one taking advantage here is you," Yancey replied evenly. "And from the looks of those bruises, you've done far worse." "My wife's health is none of your concern," Victor snapped. "Nora, come here now." "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Yancey said, stepping between Victor and the cabin. And if you're smart, you'll get back on that horse and ride away while you still can." Victor laughed, the sound chilling in its lack of warmth. "Are you threatening me, cowboy? Do you have any idea who I am? One word from me, and you'll lose this pathetic little ranch. One letter to the right officials, and you'll be the one facing charges kidnapping, perhaps. Or something worse." "You can try," Yancey acknowledged. "But around here, a man's word still counts for something. And there are plenty who've seen what you do to her, even if they've been too afraid to speak up until now." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Victor's face. "You're bluffing." "Ask the doctor who set her arm last winter," Yancey suggested. "Or the maid who helped cover those bruises before your dinner parties. People talk, Blackwood. And they've been talking about you for some time." Victor's face flushed with anger. "How dare you spread lies about me? I'll see you ruined for this." "Not lies if they're true," Yancey countered. "Now get off my land before I forget my manners entirely." The two men faced each other, the tension crackling between them. Nora held her breath, the rifle still clutched in her trembling hands. Finally, Victor turned to his men. "We're leaving. This isn't over, Rhodes. Not by a long shot." His gaze shifted to Nora, his eyes cold. "And you don't think you've escaped? You're still my wife. That means you belong to me, by law and by God." "The law might see it that way," Nora replied, finding her voice. "But God knows what you are, Victor. And so do I." With a final venomous glare, Victor mounted his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Nora lower the rifle, her knees suddenly weak with relief. Yancey was at her side in an instant, gently taking the weapon from her hands. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "No," Nora assured him, though she couldn't stop shaking. "I'm fine. Just frightened." Without hesitation, Yancey wrapped his arms around her, drawing her against his chest. The embrace was tentative at first, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, his hold tightened, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. "I shouldn't have left you alone," he murmured into her hair. "If anything had happened, how did you know?" Nora asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Ran into Jenkins on the North Ridge," Yancey explained. "He said he'd seen Blackwood and his men heading this way. I rode back as fast as Buck could carry me." Nora pulled back slightly to look up at him. "Thank you. For coming back. For standing up to him." Yancey's expression was solemn, his gray eyes intense. "I meant what I said, Nora. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to. Not while I'm breathing." The promise hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully express. Instead, Nora simply nodded, allowing herself to lean into his strength for a moment longer. "I made bread," she said finally, changing the subject. "It should still be warm." A smile broke across Yancey's face, easing the tension of the moment. "Is that what I smell? Thought I might be dreaming." The normalcy of sharing freshly baked bread and coffee at the kitchen table was a balm after the confrontation. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, each processing the events of the afternoon in their own way. As dusk fell, Yancey rose to light the lamps. "He'll be back," he said, voicing what they both knew. "A man like that doesn't give up easily." "I know," Nora acknowledged. "What do we do?" Yancey considered for a moment. "We could still try for California. My brother would help us get settled." "Us," Nora repeated, catching the change in pronoun. Yancey met her gaze steadily. "I'm not letting you face this alone, Nora. Whether that means standing our ground here, or starting fresh somewhere else, I'm with you." The declaration stole her breath. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand. "Why would you uproot your life for me?" Yancey's expression softened. "Because in the week you've been here, this place has felt more like home than it has in 3 years. Because I see your courage, your kindness, your strength even when you don't see it yourself. Because. He hesitated, then finished simply, because I care about what happens to you. More than I expected to. Tears welled in Nora's eyes. I care about you too, she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. And I'm afraid of what Victor might do to you because of it. Let me worry about Blackwood, Yancey said firmly. What do you want, Nora? Not what's safest or easiest, what do you want? It was a question no one had asked her in years. Victor had dictated her choices, from the clothes she wore to the food she ate. Even before him, her father had mapped out her education, her social circle, her future. The freedom to choose her own path was both terrifying and exhilarating. I want, she began, searching for the words. I want to stay. Here. With you. At least until we know if it's possible. The smile that broke across Yancey's face was like sunrise after a long night. Then that's what we'll do. Together. That night, Nora lay awake long after Yancey had retired to the lean-to. The confrontation with Victor had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Despite Yancey's reassurances, she knew her husband's resources and influence made him a formidable enemy. Yet for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in her fight. The memory of Yancey standing between her and Victor, unflinching in the face of threats, gave her a strange, fierce hope. Whatever came next, she would face it with someone by her side who believed in her strength rather than sought to diminish it. The following days brought no further sign of Victor, but both Nora and Yancey remained vigilant. They established new routines, never leaving the ranch unattended. Yancey taught Nora to shoot, his patience never wavering as she struggled with the rifle's kick and her own reluctance to handle a weapon. The gun is just a tool, he explained as they practiced with tin cans lined up on a fence post. Like an axe or a hammer. It's the person wielding it that matters. Slowly, Nora's confidence grew not just with firearms, but in all aspects of ranch life. She learned to ride Yancey's gentle mare, to mend fences, to predict weather changes by watching the sky. Each new skill was a victory, another step away from the helpless woman Victor had tried to create. In town, word spread quickly about Nora's presence at the Rhodes ranch. Some disapproved, whispering behind their hands when Yancey and Nora visited the general store together. Others, particularly women who had witnessed Victor's cruelty firsthand, offered quiet support. Clara Jenkins, the miller's wife, pressed a jar of honey into Nora's hands one afternoon. My grandmother's recipe for bruise salve is on the label, she whispered. And if you ever need a place to hide, our door is always open. Sheriff Powell maintained a careful neutrality when they encountered him, though he pulled Yancey aside once to murmur. Blackwood's filed formal charges of kidnapping. I've delayed serving the papers, but I can't hold him off forever. The news was sobering, prompting a serious discussion that evening as Nora and Yancey sat before the fire. We need to consider our options, Yancey said, his expression grave. If this goes to court, it'll be his word against ours. And with his connections. I know, Nora said quietly. Perhaps we should reconsider California. Yancey studied her face in the firelight. Is that what you want? Nora hesitated. Over the past weeks, the ranch had become home in a way Victor's grand house never had. The thought of leaving filled her with regret. No, she admitted. But I don't want to see you jailed because of me either. There might be another way, Yancey said slowly. If we could prove what Blackwood's done to you, document the abuse, find witnesses willing to testify, we could file countercharges. Petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty. No judge would grant it, Nora objected. Not against someone like Victor. Maybe not a local judge, Yancey agreed. But the circuit judge who comes through next month is known for his fairness. Judge Hollister doesn't bow to money or influence. Hope flickered in Nora's chest, though she tried to temper it. Even if we could find witnesses, Victor would deny everything. It would be his word against mine, and a wife's testimony against her husband rarely carries weight. Then we need more than testimony, Yancey said, determination hardening his features. We need evidence that can't be denied. And I think I know where to start. The next morning, Yancey rode to town alone, returning with Sheriff Powell and a man Nora didn't recognize, a slight, nervous fellow with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on his nose. "This is Morris Whitley," Yancey introduced him. "He's the clerk at Blackwood Timber Company. He's agreed to speak with you." Morris twisted his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said with a small bow. I've wanted to say something for a long time about Mr. Blackwood's treatment of you and others." Over coffee at the kitchen table, Morris revealed a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond Nora. Victor had systematically cheated workers out of wages, threatened those who questioned his business practices, and once had a man beaten nearly to death for organizing a protest against dangerous working conditions. "He keeps records," Morris explained, his voice low as if Victor might overhear even at this distance. "Detailed ledgers of every transaction, every bribe, every threat. It's how he maintains control, by knowing exactly who's compromised and how." "And you have access to these records?" Sheriff Powell asked, leaning forward. Morris nodded nervously. "As his clerk, yes. But if he suspected I was sharing information—" "No one would ask you to put yourself at risk," Nora assured him, touched by the man's courage in coming forward at all. "With respect, madam," Morris said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time, "I watched for 2 years while he hurt you. I did nothing. We all did nothing. It's time someone stood up to him, whatever the cost." The simple declaration moved Nora deeply. This stranger was willing to risk his livelihood, perhaps even his safety, to help her. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, goodness could emerge from unexpected places. Together, they formulated a plan. Morris would gather evidence of Victor's financial misdeeds, while Sheriff Powell would quietly collect statements from others who had witnessed the abuse. Yancey would reach out to neighboring ranchers who had been pressured into selling land to Blackwood Timber, building a case that showed a pattern of intimidation and violence. "It won't be easy," Powell warned as they concluded their meeting. "Blackwood has deep pockets and friends in high places. This could get ugly before it's over." "It's already ugly," Nora replied, her voice firm. "At least now we're facing it together." After Powell and Morris departed, Yancey found Nora standing on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. He joined her silently, offering his presence without intrusion. "I never thought I'd fight back," Nora said after a long moment. "When I ran that night, I was only thinking of escape, not justice." "Sometimes survival is enough," Yancey replied. "No one would blame you for wanting to put this behind you." Nora turned to look at him, her green eyes clear and determined. "I spent too long being afraid, Yancey. Afraid to speak, afraid to act, afraid to trust my own mind when Victor told me I was imagining things. I don't want to live in fear anymore." "You're the bravest person I know," Yancey said softly. "Brave enough to run when you needed to. Brave enough to stay and fight when the time came." Without thinking, Nora reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. The touch was electric, sending warmth up her arm and into her chest. Yancey's breath caught audibly, his eyes darkening as he looked down at their joined hands. "Nora," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she interrupted gently. "It's complicated. I'm still married, legally if not in my heart. We're facing a battle neither of us asked for. The timing couldn't be worse." "None of that changes how I feel," Yancey said, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I've tried to keep my distance, to be honorable. But every day, it gets harder to remember why I shouldn't tell you that I'm falling in love with you." The confession, so simply stated, made Nora's heart soar. Then don't remember, she whispered. Because I'm falling in love with you too. Yancey's smile was radiant in the fading light. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down until his lips were a breath from hers. May I? He asked, his voice a whisper. In answer, Nora closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle yet profound, a promise of possibilities neither had dared to imagine until now. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of growing love and mounting tension. As Judge Hollister's arrival approached, their coalition gathered strength. Clara Jenkins organized a group of women to testify about Victor's treatment of Nora. The saloon keeper, a burly man named Donovan, agreed to speak about Victor's drunken boasts of keeping his wife in line. Morris Whitley proved invaluable, secretly copying ledgers that documented years of fraud and intimidation. When he delivered the papers to Yancey one night, his hands shook with nerves. He suspects something, Morris warned. He's been asking questions, watching me. I don't think I can go back. You don't have to, Yancey assured him. We've got enough. Stay here until the hearing. You'll be safe. The addition of Morris to the household changed the dynamics slightly. Out of propriety, Nora moved to share the lean-to with Yancey, while Morris took the cabin. Though they maintained separate bedrolls, the close quarters created an intimacy that was both sweet and torturous. In whispered conversations beneath the stars, Nora and Yancey shared their hopes for the future. They spoke of expanding the ranch, perhaps adding sheep to the cattle operation. Nora admitted her dream of opening a small school for the children of neighboring homesteads. Yancey confessed his longing for a family of his own someday. I never thought I'd have that chance again, he told her one night, his voice soft in the darkness. After Lucy died, I figured that part of life was closed to me. And now? Nora asked, her heart in her throat. Yancey's hand found hers in the darkness. Now I dare to hope again. Because of you. The night before Judge Hollister was due to arrive, Victor made his move. It began with the distant glow of flames on the horizon, the Jenkins mill ablaze, a warning of what might come for those who stood against him. As the community rallied to fight the fire, Victor's men surrounded the ranch. The attack came at dawn, half a dozen hired guns emerging from the tree line as Yancey stepped onto the porch. The first shot splintered the wood near his head. Yancey dove for cover, shouting for Nora and Morris to stay inside. From behind an overturned water trough, he returned fire, his movements calm and precise despite the chaos. Inside the cabin, Nora loaded the rifle with steady hands, positioning herself at a window where she had a clear view of the attackers. When one of Victor's men broke from cover, attempting to flank Yancey's position, she took aim and fired. The shot went wide, but it forced the man back into hiding. Not bad, Morris commented, surprising her as he appeared with a small derringer in his trembling grip. Though perhaps we should leave the shooting to Mr. Rhodes. We need to help him, Nora insisted. He's outnumbered. Before Morris could respond, the cabin door burst open. Victor stood in the doorway, a revolver in his hand and fury in his eyes. Hello, wife, he said, his voice chillingly calm. Time to come home. Nora raised her rifle, but Victor was faster, striking her across the face with the back of his hand. She stumbled, the weapon clattering to the floor. Morris lunged forward with his derringer, but Victor merely laughed, knocking the small pistol aside before landing a brutal punch that sent the clerk sprawling. Did you really think you could defy me? Victor asked, grabbing Nora by the hair. A pathetic clerk and a failed rancher? This is what you chose over me. They're twice the men you'll ever be, Nora spat, tasting blood from her split lip. Victor's face contorted with rage. You'll regret those words, my dear. I promise you that. He began dragging her toward the door, his grip painfully tight. Outside, the gunfire had intensified. Nora could hear Yancey shouting, though whether in pain or defiance, she couldn't tell. As Victor pulled her onto the porch, Nora saw Yancey pinned down behind the water trough, blood staining his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. Their eyes met across the yard, and the anguish in his gaze gave her strength. With a sudden, desperate movement, Nora drove her elbow into Victor's ribs. He grunted in surprise, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. She stumbled down the porch steps, making for Yancey's position. "Kill him," Victor ordered his men, pointing at Yancey. "Kill him now." Time seemed to slow as Nora ran. She was aware of Victor raising his revolver behind her, of Yancey rising from cover with his own weapon drawn, of the thunder of approaching hoofbeats that neither she nor anyone else had noticed in the chaos. Sheriff Powell's voice cut through the mayhem like a whip crack. "Drop your weapons. All of you." A dozen riders emerged from the trees, Powell's deputies and several townsmen, including the blacksmith and Donovan from the saloon. They surrounded Victor's men, rifles trained and expressions grim. "This doesn't concern you, Sheriff," Victor called, his revolver still raised. "This is a private matter between me and my wife." "Attempted murder is the law's concern," Powell replied steadily, "as is arson, intimidation, and fraud. Put down the gun, Blackwood. It's over." For a moment, it seemed Victor might defy even this show of force. His finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes wild with thwarted rage. Then Morris Whitley appeared on the porch, a thick ledger clutched to his chest despite his bloodied face. "I have the proof, Sheriff," he called. "Every transaction, every bribe, every threat. It's all here." Something in Victor broke at the sight of his clerk and the damning evidence he held. With a howl of fury, he turned his weapon toward Morris. Before he could fire, Yancey launched himself across the yard, tackling Victor to the ground. The revolver discharged harmlessly into the air as the two men grappled in the dirt. Though wounded and exhausted, Yancey fought with the strength of a man defending everything he held dear. He landed a solid punch to Victor's jaw, then another to his midsection. Victor fought back viciously, his manicured hands clawing at Yancey's eyes, his knees driving upward in an attempt to disable his opponent. Nora watched in horror, knowing that for all Yancey's determination, Victor fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. When Victor's hand closed around a rock and raised it toward Yancey's head, she acted without thinking. Snatching up a fallen branch, Nora brought it down hard across Victor's back. He howled in pain, the rock dropping from his grasp. The momentary distraction was all Yancey needed to pin Victor's arms and flip him onto his stomach. "It's done," Yancey panted, looking up at Sheriff Powell. "Take him." As the deputies moved in to handcuff Victor, Nora knelt beside Yancey. His face was bruised, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, but his smile, when he saw her, was brilliant. "Are you all right?" they asked in unison, then laughed despite the gravity of the moment. "Better now," Yancey said, reaching up to gently touch her cheek where Victor had struck her. "Though that's going to bruise something fierce." "I've had worse," Nora replied, helping him to his feet. "And this time it was worth it." Victor glared at them as the deputies led him away. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll see you both ruined. I have friends, powerful friends. Perhaps," Sheriff Powell acknowledged. "But they might be less eager to associate with you once Judge Hollister reviews the evidence." He nodded toward Morris, who still clutched the ledger like a shield. "Your clerk has been very thorough, Blackwood. Very thorough indeed." As the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, Nora found herself sitting beside Yancey on the porch steps while Doc Miller stitched the bullet graze on his arm. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, leaving her shaky and exhausted but also strangely light, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. "It's really over, isn't it?" she asked, watching as Powell's men escorted Victor and his hired guns toward town. "Not quite," Yancey replied, wincing as the doctor tied off a stitch. "There's still the hearing." testimony to give, legal matters to settle. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious. But the worst is behind us, yes? Nora nodded, leaning slightly against his uninjured side. What happens now? To us, I mean. Yancey's good arm came around her shoulders, drawing her closer. That depends on what you want, Nora. I meant what I said before. I love you. But I understand if you need time-space to figure out who you are without him casting a shadow over everything. The offer was so typical of Yancey, generous, thoughtful, putting her needs before his own desires. It made her love him all the more. I know exactly who I am, she said firmly. I'm the woman who ran from a house that beat her. And I'm the woman who found strength she never knew she had, because a good man believed in her when no one else did. Yancey's smile was tentative, hope warring with caution in his expression. And what does that woman want? She wants to build a life here, Nora answered, taking his hand in hers. With you. If you'll have her. If I'll have you? Yancey repeated, incredulous. Nora, having you in my life would be the greatest gift I could imagine. But nothing, she interrupted gently. We've faced worse than legal complications, Yancey Rhodes. We can wait until the divorce is final if that's what concerns you. I'm not going anywhere. The relief in his eyes was profound. Neither am I, he promised. Not ever again. The months that followed were challenging but ultimately triumphant. Judge Hollister, true to his reputation for fairness, reviewed the evidence against Victor with grave attention. The testimony of Morris Whitley was particularly damning, laying bare years of corruption and violence that extended far beyond Victor's treatment of Nora. Clara Jenkins organized the women of the community to speak on Nora's behalf, each recounting what they had witnessed or suspected about the abuse she had suffered. Their solidarity was a powerful counterpoint to Victor's attempts to paint Nora as unstable and Yancey as an opportunist who had stolen another man's wife. When Nora herself took the stand, she spoke with a clarity and conviction that silenced the courtroom. She detailed the progression of Victor's abuse, from subtle control to outright violence, without flinching or apologizing. When Victor's lawyer attempted to suggest she had invented the allegations out of infidelity, she met his gaze steadily. I did not leave my husband because I had feelings for another man, she stated. I left because I wanted to live. The fact that I later found love with someone who treats me with respect is a blessing, not a crime. In the end, Judge Hollister not only granted the divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, but also issued indictments against Victor for fraud, intimidation, and attempted murder. The evidence Morris had provided led to further charges involving corrupt business practices and bribery of officials. Victor Blackwood, once the most powerful man in the county, was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. His assets were seized, his company dissolved, his reputation shattered beyond repair. For Nora, the victory was bittersweet. While she rejoiced in her freedom and the justice that had been served, she also mourned the years lost to fear and pain. There were nights when she woke trembling from nightmares, convinced that Victor had somehow escaped and found her. On those nights, Yancey would hold her close, his steady heartbeat beneath her ear a reminder that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was home. They married in the spring, a simple ceremony in the meadow behind the ranch house. Clara Jenkins helped Nora sew a dress of cream-colored cotton embroidered with wildflowers. Sheriff Powell stood as witness, along with Morris Whitley, who had found employment as the town's new accountant. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of twisted willow branches, Nora felt a sense of rightness that transcended the day's joy. This was not an ending, but a beginning a life built on mutual respect and genuine love rather than control and fear. I promise to honor your strength, Yancey vowed, his voice clear in the spring air. To cherish your independence as much as your company. To be your partner in all things, not your master in anything. The words brought tears to Nora's eyes, a healing balm to wounds that had once seemed beyond repair. "And I promise to trust in that strength," she replied. "To believe in myself as you believe in me. To build a home with you that shelters but never confines." Their kiss was witnessed by friends who had become family, by a community that had ultimately chosen to stand against cruelty and for justice. As cheers erupted around them, Yancey wrapped his coat around Nora's shoulders against the spring breeze, an echo of that first night, a gesture that had come to symbolize safety and care freely given. In the years that followed, the Rhodes ranch prospered. Yancey's careful management and Nora's keen business sense led to expansion, more cattle, better breeding stock, eventually the sheep operation they had once dreamed of. The lean-to was replaced by a proper addition to the cabin, with a separate room where Nora established a small school for neighboring children 3 days a week. Their first child, a daughter they named Emma, arrived on a snowy night in their second year of marriage. Yancey paced the porch while Clara Jenkins attended Nora, his face ashen with worry until the newborn's cry pierced the night. When he held his daughter for the first time, the wonder in his expression made Nora fall in love with him all over again. "She's perfect," he whispered, a calloused finger gently tracing the baby's cheek. "Just like her mother." 2 years later, twins William and James joined the family, boisterous boys with their father's gray eyes and their mother's determined spirit. The cabin expanded again to accommodate the growing family, each addition built by Yancey's hands with logs harvested from their own land. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Nora stood on the porch watching Yancey teach Emma to ride her pony, the twins attempting to help from their perch on the corral fence. The scene filled her with a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She thought of the frightened young woman who had fled into the night, bloody and desperate. That woman could never have imagined this future, this family, this home, this life built on love rather than fear. Yancey looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. His smile, still as bright as the day she first saw it, warmed her from the inside out. He excused himself from Emma's riding lesson and crossed to the porch, wrapping his arms around Nora from behind. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Rhodes," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Nora leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him. "I was thinking about how far we've come," she admitted. "About that night I ran from Victor's house. How terrified I was. How I had no idea where I was going, only that I couldn't stay." Yancey's arms tightened slightly. "That was the bravest thing I ever saw," he said. "You with your feet all cut up, half frozen, still standing your ground. I knew right then you were something special." Nora turned in his arms to face him. At 35, Yancey was even more handsome than when they'd met, a few threads of silver at his temples, laugh lines deeper around his eyes, his face weathered by years working under the Montana sun. But his gaze still held the same kindness, the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. "I love you, Yancey Rhodes," she said simply. "More today than yesterday. More tomorrow than today." "And I love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Now and always." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had built together, Yancey once again wrapped his coat around Nora's shoulders. It was worn now, patched in places, but still warm, still a symbol of that first night when a desperate woman had found not just shelter, but the promise of a love that would heal rather than harm. Nora smiled up at her husband, thinking of all they had overcome and all that lay ahead. They had weathered storms together, faced down threats, built something lasting and true from the ashes of pain. Whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced everything side by side, partners in all things. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "The children are hungry, and I promised them your mother's biscuit recipe for supper." "Yes, madam," Yancey replied with a grin, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss before following her inside. As they stepped through the door of the home they had created together, Nora knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen this life, this man, this love. And in that choice made freely, without fear, she had found not just safety, but joy. The night she had run from a house that beat her had been the darkest of her life. But it had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this love that had wrapped around her and stayed. And for that, she would be forever grateful.